that are non-fiscal in nature, right? But there have been just as many studies that we've done that show that for a lot of reasons, it's cheaper to do what you don't want to encourage. That doesn't mean you should continue doing that either. But downtown Las Vegas is a great example. We were the economic consultant on the downtown master plan. And so we were asked to look at what happens if nothing happens, nothing changes in downtown Las Vegas, what can we expect from a residential and non-residential market perspective? And the picture wasn't very rosy. And so then the question became, well, what happens if what kind of economic levers do you have to pull to move the lever in order to have things happen? So sort of some of the existing things, or sort of the things that were working against Las Vegas, were that because, well, first of all, I should back up. Has anybody heard of the Downtown Project in Las Vegas? Tony Hsieh from Zappos. So Tony Hsieh has invested, I think it was like $360 billion of his own money about 10 years ago. Once they moved from Henderson, they bought the old City Hall building, and he basically bankrolled redevelopment in a certain part of town. What has happened there is, because of that development, it's created an artificial market in the area surrounding it. So a lot of times redevelopment won't pencil out because the land values have been inflated. There's also all sorts of issues related to crime and the perception of crime and other types of issues related to safety downtown that is discouraging people from living there that don't work for Tony Hsieh. And what's happened is, over time, in fact, when we were doing the study, he actually even pulled out of some of those businesses he was backing, because without his money, they wouldn't be sustainable. And if you had a choice between living downtown or living in Summerlin, you could get a lot more for your money in Summerlin and be safe and have all these amenities, where downtown was more for the hipster crowd that were working for Zappos. But anyway, regardless of that, affordability and a lack of diversity in housing were huge issues down there. The vacancy rates were 3,000 or 300% more than Clark County as a whole. Land assemblage issues exist. It's hard to be successful redevelopment if you're not going to use eminent domain. And I know that can be controversial, but sometimes you have to have that happen. Another challenge with Las Vegas is that any sort of city participation in a project triggered prevailing wage requirements, which also added to the difficulty in certain projects penciling out. And so all of these things were working against downtown Vegas. And so we looked at, as I said, the base case versus what happens if here's the conservative estimate versus moderate versus aggressive versus super aggressive in terms of what you could expect if you did certain things. And this is just, we're economists, we don't make graphics like this. This is from a planning architecture firm. But this just sort of gives you an idea of, as part of this public engagement process, this is what everybody expected. Parks and plazas, open space, 7 linear miles of parks, 15 linear miles of public bike lanes or something, urban trails, tree canopies. All of this costs money, right? So when you look at something like downtown Vegas, where you want all of that infrastructure, and a lot of that infrastructure, frankly, is needed to help capture the super aggressive market demand scenario, but you also need to do things like implement an aggressive downtown housing strategy. That has a cost. Residential housing incentives, that has a cost. I told them they needed to give away land for the first 5 to 7 years to get things happening there. So you can buy down that cost of land or give it away. That has a huge cost. Assembling property, establishing an economic development capital fund really didn't have a cost. That's an idea where you set up a mutual fund and individuals or businesses can invest in that mutual fund, and that mutual fund basically gives seed money to redevelopment projects, and then the fund gets the return on the investment. All of this has costs. And as you can see, the city did not do a fiscal analysis because they only paid us for the market analysis. But if you added up all of those costs, and we didn't even put costs to these, you can see very clearly that the cost per acre would probably far outweigh the revenue per acre. But that's not a reason to not do it, because of all the economic benefits that would happen. And just the other things that, like, as a result of this effort, the UNLV announced that they were going to have their own medical school, and they located it downtown, which was huge for downtown. So again, all of that investment leads to things like medical tourism happening, and medical tourism will happen now because of the hospital there. The Cleveland Clinic is downtown now also, and so again, smart growth we're in favor of, but it always doesn't pencil out. Another great example was in Shreveport, Louisiana, and Denton, Texas. The cost to rehab the substandard utility infrastructure was so great that because it couldn't support the densities that were being planned or envisioned as part of the land use plan. So again, that's a situation where the cost per acre is higher than the revenue, but there are reasons to go forward with that. Now here's a counter opposite. So in Somerville, Massachusetts, which is right hop, skip, and a jump from downtown Boston. In fact, my wife lived there right out of college, and they called it Slummerville. It was such a dump. And she can't believe what's going on there now when I tell her. I think they've got one of the highest educated workforces in the United States. I think it's now the most dense community in the United States, but it's getting all sorts of redevelopment at a place called Assembly Square. And these two developments that we did the work on, Union Square and Boynton Yards, and we showed there that even with these major infrastructure investments, $25 million for roads and streetscapes, for Union Square, $18 million for Boynton Yards, utility upgrades, $35 million, $21 million, new fire station, $21 million, that still, with all those costs, after the initial years, made sense fiscally, right? So there's an example where the revenue per acre would be higher than the cost. Okay? So it's not a cut and dried proposition. That's my point to you, is that if as planners or economic developers we want to convince people about our position, it's important that the background materials we're using to support those positions will pass the straight face test in terms of the analysis. So, as I mentioned earlier, fiscal analysis is both a science and an art. I mean, I hope you can appreciate from the examples I gave you that things could sway one way or the other if you made different assumptions. You can't use these generalizations, the one-size-fits-all, the smart growth versus residential versus non-residential, and what they do to your community. Fiscal impacts, it's important to note, are only one part of the equation. You got to look at affordable housing, environmental impacts, transportation impacts, economic impacts, et cetera. And the goal with the study should be to educate not only your citizenry, but also elected officials going forward. Now, let's skip this. The last thing I wanted to talk about is funding the gap. Believe it or not, there aren't that many tools in our toolbox nationally for funding the gap. They're really quite limited. One is impact fees, stormwater and transportation utilities. Most people are probably familiar with stormwater utilities. They're certainly gaining in popularity, but I think also in the future, you're going to see more and more folks interested in transportation utilities. There's a few in Oregon right now, there's one in Colorado, but I think you're going to see more of those. Special purpose sales taxes, special purpose property taxes, excise or development taxes, insurance premium tax, jurisdictional revenue sharing. There's not a whole lot of options out there. One thing I didn't put on here, we're seeing more and more of is public-private partnerships. You're going to see a lot more of that in the future. But there's not much out there relative to nationwide, really. Basically, you're looking at your general taxes or just a few other vehicles. And so whenever you're looking at any type of infrastructure financing alternative, the things that we look at are, one, is the revenue yield. That's obvious, right? How much money is it going to generate, and what's the timing of that cash flow? Meaning, are the funds going to be there in the time such you need it? Administrative ease, how easy it is to implement. For instance, it's easy to pass a sales tax administratively, to increase your property tax. It's not easy to set up an impact fee program because you've got to set up an impact fee coordinator, you've got annual accounting requirements and reporting requirements. It's not as easy as simply raising the property tax. Or third, is it legal in your community? Do you need specific enabling legislation? Proportionality, that's where we look at, well, what relationship does the amount that the fee payer or what that burden is relative to the service or the infrastructure that you're consuming. So in that case, impact fees score high because you have to show proportionality as part of the impact fee exercise, where there is no proportionality with sales tax or property tax. It's simply based on how much you spend or how much your property's worth, not how much roadway that you consume on a monthly basis. And then the thing that varies from jurisdiction to jurisdiction is the public acceptance. This one I think is actually from Beaufort County, South Carolina, where we scored that negatively because they've had 3 referendums for a capital outlay sales tax, which we showed would solve all of their infrastructure problems. It's been defeated 3 times. That same type of tax has, every time it's gone to the voters in Oklahoma City, has been passed every time because they do a much better job of educating folks how the money's going to be used and showing them the results. So they actually have increments that are dedicated to different areas of the local government, like there's a fire vehicles increment, there's a police increment, there's a fire operations increment. So every time they go out, they're able to pass that. And so that's what really varies from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. Now I want to talk about a few things related to impact fees, particularly transportation, that have sort of changed or evolved over the last 10 years. And that is, and this is more sort of general planning, transportation, land use connection stuff, but everybody who's a planner here knows that over the last 10, 15 years, there's sort of been this transition of, thinking spatially about transportation. So when we look at, trying to incentivize development, and a lot of people forget that impact fees are actually a land use regulation. A land use regulation that happens to generate revenue, but it is a land use regulation. And so there are ways that you can craft transportation fees, to a certain extent fire and water and sewer, to incentivize or help incentivize behavior. So we get asked a lot, Bozeman, Montana was an example, Sandpoint, Idaho was an example. We want to encourage and incentivize development downtown. So what you can do is evaluate the transportation land use network, and so we look at these different D variables. So what are the demographics in that area? What's the land use characteristics in terms of density, the diversity, meaning the amount of horizontal and mixed use? What's the development scale? And then what's the design? What's the destination accessibility? What's the distance to transit? And so when all these things converge nationally, we find an average of about 29% reduction in traditional trip generation rates as a result of this. And so taking it further, this was from the Washoe County, Nevada Regional Transportation Commission, where we look at the demographics there, the urban core versus the suburban situation. You see that the vehicles available are different, person per household are different, the mixes are different, the trip rates are different, the percentage of folks that use autos and versus other modes of transportation differ, and then the average of vehicle miles of travel differ as well. And so what you can have happen in downtown areas, or even in a suburban context where you're trying to encourage connectivity and mixed-use development, is you get these reductions. And so a lot of times what we'll do is, like at Sandpoint and Bozeman, you basically set up tiers or zones where development in this area pays a lesser impact fee because of all these things converging, so the trip rates are less because there's higher internal trip capture, and so the fee structure is lower. You can also set up almost what we call floating zones in the suburban context, where you define criteria, and we call it a trip exchange district, where if a project meets these objectives in terms of the density, the mix of uses, the connectivity, the availability of alternative modes of transportation, et cetera, then you qualify for that reduction. So it's another way to sort of help incentivize the type of behavior that you're trying to encourage. And we did that type of work in Sandpoint. The other thing that's interesting about Sandpoint, and we're doing a lot of this also, is using a progressive residential fee structure. And what I mean by progressive fee structure is that we can tie the assessor's data to the census and show that as housing units increase in size, so too do the number of people, the number of vehicles available, and the vehicle trips. And so what happens is it promotes affordable housing and housing equity because the smaller houses are paying less because they consume less, and the larger houses are paying more. The side benefit is it now makes a fee behave more like a tax, and so the more expensive houses are paying a higher impact fee. So that you're seeing more and more of that around the country as well. Bozeman was the same type of situation, and in both of these, we're seeing multi-use pathways as part of the transportation network. So the focus on a lot of impact fees is moving away from the traditional capacity kind of enhancements to the whole idea of moving people. Like we're doing a fee right now in Tempe, Arizona. It has no interchanges or no roadways. It's all pedestrian connectivity, bridges, flyovers, bus-related infrastructure as well. And with that, I'm happy to answer any questions you have. I'm surprised we didn't have more during the presentation.